Welcome in Arizona Cardinals fans to the Redbird Reboot. We're back here, and Marcos is my normal co-host. He'll join us here in a few minutes. So for now, I've got two other people joining on the podcast today. We have Walter Mitchell, of course, from Revenge of the Birds, as well as hosting the Red Rain podcast, and Joe Como back again during the bye week so we can break things down, also known as the Cardinal Rule. On Twitter and YouTube, you'll be able to at least follow him at Joe Como, which is also his name, just a little bit different as far as for how you typically spell it. But let's start at least over here with Walter and see how are you doing today at least, and how has the bye week been as far as either getting some time off or in some cases maybe having an extra chance to work a little bit harder on grinding out some of what we've seen for the Cards this year.
Yeah, thanks, Blake. Yeah, it was a fun week coming off a great win, so that always feels nice. And was still reveling in that victory. I wanted to turn it into a whole victory week, so that was really a nice surprise. And we got a complete team effort in that game, and uh, all sorts of resiliency and perseverance through what was a monsoon and two lengthy delays and a lot of things working against the Cardinals in that situation, and they just prevailed over all of it, which took the bitter taste of that Ram debacle out of our mouths, I imagine. And now I look forward to the 49ers. I hope we can make a statement against them. We have not played well against NFC West teams, so I'm a little nervous about this because I don't want to see it get worse. And then you look at the 49ers and how they're rolling. Um, just makes me wonder what we're in for on Sunday.
Absolutely, yeah. And Joe, the bye week, the Cardinals, I think most people, if you look at not just Vegas predictions, but most predictors around had the Cardinals as not just underdogs, but nearly one touchdown underdogs. They go into the bye week instead with a win, the third of the first season for Jonathan Gannon and Monty Ossenfort. And also are now 2-2 with Kyler Murray. This is something that I think a lot of Cardinals fans would probably hoping for, but maybe not necessarily expected, at least I would say, against a Steelers team. How do you feel about the Cards with some chance to reflect on the win?
Yeah, and I'm a big fan of Mike Tomlin. I think he's, such an amazing coach who has never had a losing season despite having a number of years with questionable rosters at points. And, their quarterback situation right now, obviously with Kenny Pickett and, but there's this floor, right? They're a team that is well coached and clearly doesn't have losing seasons. So that's not a game I expected to see the Cardinals win in a blowout fashion, right? 24-10 against such a well-coached team. Certainly, people know that the Steelers, went on to lose to the Patriots, another well-coached team that's having a really rough year. So certainly Pittsburgh seems to be trending downwards right now within the season. But that was not one I expected that outcome for. So that is a huge positive. And, going into the bye week, coming off of, a game that not only was a win, a full team win, but where Kyler played much more efficient than he had up to this point. His PFF grades were demonstrably better than he had in his first three games back. And the stat line and the box score looked kind of similar across all those games. Not a ton of yards, not a ton of touchdowns in any of them, but the efficiency and how he played in things that don't show up in the simple box score were much better. So I think this is a great moment for the Cardinals in terms of within the season. You mentioned they're 2-2 with Kyler back. This was his best game, a win that, against a well-coached team. And now they get to go into the bye week, kind of reflect on that, figure out where they're at, look at what the next steps are for Kyler's acclimation to this offense, and figure out what they're going to do down the stretch of these last four games.
I think that's great. And it's interesting as far as seeing how different things will affect such as efficiency. I think a lot of Cardinals fans, if you look at the base stats, you forget that the game had to be gone through two rain delays because you think about, under 60% completion percentage, 145 yards. But the way that game was as far as for consistency, it kind of came down to two key moments, and then also not making some of the key mistakes, at least down the stretch. First key moment, I think the half has to be talked about. You've got a fourth down stop by the Cardinals, Kevin Strong. The Cardinals had not necessarily had the best grades, I think, in different places, but as we've seen in the National Football League, even if you have times where you let teams march down the field, or that there's teams that seem like that they are able to look like the better team for the most part, key plays are the ability to then overcome some of those deficiencies. And so we saw them get that fourth down stop. And that was also, of course, with Kenny Pickett being injured, at least on the play before, running on third down. It was a very strange, like, delayed draw type of play. He leaves, Mitchell Trubisky comes in. The Cardinals then go from their 1 yard line, 99 yards down the field. I have to give at least a shout out to the Cardinals' new running back that they at least had overall in believe it
Michael
was
Carter.
Carter. That's right. I almost said Michael Wilson. Like, no, we'll get him back this week. Picking up at least another clutch 20 plus yards on third down, where he essentially is able to make a guy miss. No one there ends up having the follow up for the tackle. And then after that, it was just the Trey McBride show where Kyler was able to essentially pick on. And that's where I think the second interesting moment of the play is that the Steelers lost one of their better coverage linebackers. But at the end of it, it wasn't necessarily that he had been blanketing McBride. I think it was more of the Cardinals adjusted their game plan to recognize and say, hey, we're able to get one-on-one matchups with the guy who the Steelers just are not going to be able to cover. And at that point, you ended up taking 7 points off of the Steelers board, put 7 points onto the Cardinals board. They didn't fumble when there was two of these, I think, snap exchange later in the game. That would have been the Steelers' opportunity to strike back, because after that, there was just not a lot of offense to be had. The Cardinals were able to close out the game pretty swiftly overall with a win 24-10. And this is one of those areas if the Cardinals have essentially 3 signature wins on the season. They have one against the Dallas Cowboys, which has been shocking. They have one against the, I guess, tied for the division lead Atlanta Falcons. And they have one against the 7-4, now I believe it's 7-6 Pittsburgh Steelers. And I think the big question to ask here is how much of this is Arizona kind of hitting these teams in the right place and right situation, just pieces falling together, and how much of it is missed opportunities in some of these other games. Walter, would love to hear what you think at least about it, because you've advocated, said you do think there's enough talent on this roster to win games.
Oh, I do. And I think I was charting the other day the draft pick depth they have across the roster, first rounders, second rounders, third rounders. I mean, and some of these players aren't developed yet, but you hope that, they're have a year or two under their belts, like McBride suddenly now is emerging. Gotta love what we're seeing from him. Want to piggyback what you said, Blake, about that 99-yard drive. It was the stunning thing to me was we shunned the third and give up offense by throwing past the sticks. Finally, and repeatedly, what did they end up? 7 for 11 on third down conversions. That was a huge breakthrough. And to find that chemistry between Kyler and McBride was fantastic. In fact, it has me dreaming right now, as I was writing on Revenge of the Birds today, about some draft opportunities if they trade down and Harrison's off the board. I'm fascinated to see if they would consider taking Brock Bowers to be on one side. You know how Petzing loves the 12 personnel. Can you imagine teams having to try to defend, McBride on one side, Bowers on the other, and then combination routes when they're on the same side? I mean, what that would do to other teams' safeties and how it would occupy them would actually probably make the vertical passing game up the sidelines easier. It could have a ripple effect. But there are in my mind, two elite big receivers in this draft, Harrison and Bowers. And I think if you think of the way Bowers receives the football, it's a fascinating choice there. Now there are other positions obviously to address. But yeah, as far as the other games, it's a great question. We have not played well in second halves, and particularly in fourth quarters. The scoring disparity has been enormous. Hey, Marcos.
Hey, sorry about that, guys.
Hey, you look good, bud.
No, thank you. I'm a little bit under the weather, but it's fine.
Yeah, we were just talking about how big that Steelers win was, and how Blake asked a great question of maybe it makes us think we could have played better in other games up to that point. What was your take on the Steelers game and win?
Well, like I had mentioned before, I think it was one of the best full team wins because even though the defense was giving up yards and stuff, they had been able to keep not only the Steelers out of the red zone, and they kept them out of the end zone as well. And it really did help that Kenny Pickett was out with the injury and whatnot. And that was a good take on defense at the very least, even though I don't believe they sacked the quarterback one time, but they were able to get some pressure and good coverage. So the rotation that they have going is really working well. Obviously, James Conner had himself a game that we've been needing for him to have against a team like this, because before we were talking about this game, we were all talking about how it's going to be either a demolishing or a manslaughter of the Cardinals, and the run game really didn't need to come through, and it came through in a big way. So good congratulations to James Conner. And on the side of Kyler Murray, I saw what I liked about was I saw the accuracy on those deep throws was starting to come back. So that was one thing that I was really liked, and especially that throw he had rolling to his right where he hit Rondell Moore in the end zone that unfortunately was called back. We're all shaking our heads about that because it probably shouldn't have been called, but there's still little intricacies of stuff that he still needs to get better in. But those throws, at least he didn't miss on those throws where he was missing on them before.
And you know what I really liked about that play too was that how Rondale missed the first deep pass that was right in his hands, but he had traffic, and up to this date he hasn't had a lot of reps at 50-50 balls, so I give him a mulligan there. But look at how he saw the ball through to the triangle over Pat P on that sensational what should have been a touchdown. So it showed how he was adjusting from one play to the next, and it's just too bad they got called back because that was a stunningly beautiful play.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I felt like I saw enough at least to say if you're going to end up calling for a hold there, you'd love to have the ability to throw a challenge flag in some of those penalties. But
I know.
It's just kind of how it is for the most part. I know that this week the Kansas City at least has had a call that they felt like was unfair, which to me I would say, look, I can at least measure offsides pretty clearly. As far as seeing the holding call, one of the players flailed a little bit enough. I think it's a spot that Arizona being able to overcome some of those setbacks does show a bit of a mentality, because as we've seen in previous weeks, timing of some of the different penalties or making key mistakes when you're in a battle like the Cardinals were in, it's about who can at least avoid not just the least penalties, but the timing of them. A good example of Marco saying it was all three phases of special teams being included. Greg Dortch has a nice punt return. There was also, I believe it was the Steelers committed a personal foul penalty while trying to be able to actually make the tackle or make a play, jar the ball loose. Cost them 15 yards. It set the Cardinals up within the Pittsburgh 32-yard line, essentially, where they were already within field goal distance. And that was at a time in the game where you really were, if you're Pittsburgh, backed up, your defense needs to hold. Instead, you're essentially giving Arizona points to be able to make it a 2-score game, which of course they did. That reminded me a lot of the 3rd and 37 type of penalty we saw the previous week against the Rams, where you're like, oh, this is one of the worst types of penalties you can have as far as timing, where you're coming out of the half, you've got a first down, you're trying to make it, and then they have multiple penalties back them up to the point where they're punting from their own end zone and have to give the ball right back to a hot Rams team without actually having to be able to make any of the adjustments. And I think that seeing the team be able to bounce back and be able to stay disciplined, I think is a good selling point for how I think that they are going to have to go out and compete the rest of the season, which is they're going to have to do their best to play mistake-free football and be able to trust some of the guys like Kyler and Hollywood to be able to make up for if there are some of these types of mistakes. And I think the question is, it'll be interesting, is there going to be an opportunity for them to do that against some of these opponents? Joe, we can talk a lot about the Cardinals who they have played. They've played all of the teams that they're going to be playing in the upcoming game, save for two. One of them is incredibly familiar to Jonathan Gannon, as he and many of the staff members came from their last year in the Philadelphia Eagles, who have lost a few games straight and haven't looked quite as strong as they were last year. And also the Chicago Bears, a team who has actually looked pretty decent, was able to get a win of themselves last week. After that, it's San Francisco and Seattle. How do you feel like the upcoming game, at least, what do we need to see from this team as far as to be competitive in some of these games?
Yeah, so the 49ers, one of the better rosters in the NFL, and their quarterback has played well this year. Obviously, Brock Purdy. There's been a lot of discussion about him, whether it's the system or him, or how much it is of that. That in the 49ers game, to be quite frank, I just want to see them not get blown out. Right, be competitive, see the defense show up and not get run over like they did last time by CMC, and see the offense be able to move the ball a bit. And San Francisco, one of the better teams in the NFL, tough matchup with their defense and their pass rush. And what's particularly tough, and this is kind of to a point of something that I think is going on with Kyler, and we'll probably talk about this more, but I think with what Kyler is doing now, which is trying to acclimate to this offense, I think there's a lot of plays where in the past he would have hit the eject button and kind of got himself out of the pocket and scrambled, where now he's trying to stay in the pocket, step up. And I think that's an intentional thing that I think he's trying to do for this offense to acclimate to it. There were a lot of plays, or a number of plays against the Steelers where you saw pressure, and normally Kyler would be going backwards and scrambling, and he hung in there, sometimes ducked and took the sack. And I think that's a choice. So I think with San Francisco, with what their pass rush is like, and the fact that I think he's trying to stay in the pocket more, that becomes a particularly difficult matchup. So in that game, just don't get blown out. The Bears game, you really want to see the Cardinals win that. This is a winnable game. A team certainly came off a great week. They've got a huge win under the belt this last week, but it's a team that if you want to show that you're building something, right, as the Cardinals, and you want to show that you're well coached, and you want to show that you're making the most of your talent, you're trending in the right direction, this is a game you want to win. Philly's a tough one, even though, as you mentioned, they've been struggling. It's, in terms of the roster, it's a tough matchup. Seattle, they struggled this last week. That's a game that could be winnable, but is still a team with a much better record than the Cardinals. In my mind, if the Cardinals come out of that stretch with one win, I feel like they're on track. If they come out of that stretch with 2 wins, I think we should be very happy.
I think that is a good way to be able to put it, especially since a lot of people are looking at what did we expect from this Cardinals team this season, I think is a huge portion. Usually what you do is you want to look at personal expectations, what you look for, and then there's national expectations, and a lot of that comes down to, is the team more competitive than they're being projected, and are they winning more than people are projecting, and are there other goals or accomplishments that are being made? And entering the season, we knew we weren't going to get Kyler at least for 6 weeks. We knew it was going to probably be longer than that, given where he was at, and that the Cardinals were not going to rush his return. I think that a lot of fans expected that the team was going to be in line for a top 5 pick. I think they expected they could have 2 of those, but another team in the Houston Texans seemed to exceed expectations, although they've kind of dropped back down a little bit. At the end of the day, I think our expectations satisfied if the Cardinals go out there and say that they compete like how they have been the last few weeks, but still drop the last 4 games? Or do we want to see them at least be able to try to pull another win or maybe even play spoiler to a team, such as knocking the Niners down a peg if they are able to kind of catch them off guard, or knocking a team like Seattle out of the playoffs, getting a road win in December. The Cardinals have at least been able to help fans by getting a home win, by getting a road win, and now they at least have a third win on the season to essentially keep them out of the uh, the idea of, hey, the only teams that they've beaten are like the teams that are just not having enough talent for them for the most part. Like, they were missing all these players. It feels at least like the Atlanta Falcons win is probably the signature one of the season, if I had to put it, because it was at least a game that was probably close and competitive. And because it was done with Kyler Murray, I think the question is, do we need to see another signature win this season? Or are we kind of at a spot where we can say, hey, just don't get blown out 4 games in a row and just have embarrassing losses to some of these teams where it looks like you just, all right, we got our third win and now season's over? Because I don't think that's something that Jonathan Gannon is wired that way. And I don't think that he wants players who are wired that way. Walter, what do you think as far as with looking for another signature win? Or is this the spot where Cardinals fans were just kind of have to be content with a down season and be able to look at the foundation moving forward?
Well, we're 0-4 in the NFC West, being outscored by 70 points. It's been awful, uncompetitive. And quite frankly, as someone who studies the other teams, frightfully unprepared for that McVay offense. That was really a downer for me. We hire a defensive-minded head coach, and there have been times this year I just like looking at that defense and going like, they're like drowning out there and nobody's throwing a life preserver. And just the basic, for example, a McVay offense it's the bread and butter starts with the off tackle play. The bread and butter off tackle play. And what you have to do is set the edge on that and squeeze it down. We weren't doing that in both games. Kyron Williams just had open field for 2 whole games. Plus, we don't have a Mike linebacker. Everybody's lauding Kaiser White. He's not a Mike. He's just not. Mm-hmm. He's a converted safety whose ideal position, if he comes in the box, is it weak. But he's not a Mike linebacker. If you look at his games, particularly in the NFC West, he's on 2 of them, he had the worst PFF grade in the whole team. I mean, this is your captain and Mike on defense. You can't have that. Now, when he's been good, he's been great. The Dallas game, he was fantastic. But you need a consistent player there. It just frustrates me to no end that Zaven Collins, what does he have, 22 tackles on the whole season? I mean, when we've got good edge players, we don't need him on the edge. And he's a prototypical Mike. I mean, he's got the size, he's got the thumper attitude. I just don't understand that move. There are moves like that. Don't understand how you continue to roll out Marco Wilson when it was clear he was getting picked on. It was clear he was demoralized. And then they finally make a switch and the other guys are playing more aggressive, like Keitrell Clark. I love that kid. So the concern for me is, I mean, Steve Keim said this, and he's right. If you hire a defensive-minded head coach, he'd better be special. I mean, and we have, according to PFF, the worst defense in the NFL right now. So, and people are saying it's lack of talent. And that really bothers me because, no, we're not like 49ers talent, but we showed against the Steelers. You don't go into Pittsburgh and win like that without talent. You just don't. And, that Falcons game, Blake, which you were talking about, that was one of the better games, too, from start to finish. And it was really awesome that Kyler put together that last-minute drive with the scintillating scramble, and then they played the clock perfectly. Mm-hmm. So you see them in situations like that, but then the next week in Texas, they can't even get the ball snapped on a 2-minute drill. It's just like, what?
Yeah.
What's
16
happening
points
here?
on 3 turnovers, at least, is one of the areas of just seeing the offense not being able to help with the defensive side. I think also that there's been, at least as far as when it comes to talent, there have been pieces that have been missing from this Cardinals team that we can't neglect. They were missing both of their safeties for an early stretch of the season, as well as Trey McBride did not get the opportunity that he probably needed to earlier in the year, and we're now seeing he's making the most of those opportunities. They did lose, obviously, Kaiser White, and have had to adjust since then, but I think what's interesting also is seeing how they've developed with BJ Ojolari now being able to actually have more playing time on the edge, of being able to get to the passer, of him being able to have, I believe it was another, if it wasn't a sack, it was at least a close breakup or a tackle for loss that he had against the Steelers. I do feel like in a lot of ways that this is a Cardinals team that, as far as the construction has been, they're almost a team that recognized we're not going to have all of the pieces that we're going to need. Like it's where you're kind of having to build a Lego house before you're going to be able to kind of get the blueprints in place, just because they've really not spent very much compared to any other team for the most part. They didn't invest very much in free agency. I do agree with you, Walter, that there was pieces that I think that the team could have pursued to try to upgrade that they did not, as far as being able to bring some other players in. And it is a first-time coaching staff. Marcos, I think it'd be interesting to see, do you think that this is a case where part of the Cardinals, we can talk about, if teams are tanking or stuff, we've seen it back and forth. We've seen a team that's been very competitive. But do you think that being competitive is enough? Because this is not a team that necessarily was aggressive in trying to sign other players, making different trades. I would even argue that they really did not go out and do a very good job of finding a good running back to spell James Conner up until someone was cut from the Jets this year, and Michael Carter. And it was almost like they went in saying, we want more draft picks to prove it, see who's going to be here next year. Or do you disagree and feel like this has been a different type of season for what the team's expectations were going to be?
We're not even really clear of what the expectations were, because we really don't know what the intentions are for Monty Ossenfort. I know there's a lot of talk about like how Monty Ossenfort has said that his guys are not his guys, so he has been showing that he is cutting a lot of like Steve Kine picks and whatnot, but I think a lot of it does have to go with when he took this job, and I think that's true about him and Jonathan Gannon. I never worried about whether they're going to move off of Kyler Murray. I even thought to myself, if they got the number 1 or number 2 pick, they were just going to trade back, because they never ever had the intention. They wanted to see what they can do, because I don't know if you heard this before, but like coaches in the NFL have this thought that they can always say, hey, I can fix that guy, or hey, I can fix that situation. So they want to take that challenge on a lot of times. Like we just heard about it with Frank Reich and Bryce Young, where Frank Reich got fired because he didn't want Bryce Young. But now we're talking about like, hey, who's gonna be the guy who gets fired in Carolina? Who's gonna take that job with the owner that they have? David Tepper being like very, very like intrusive and whatnot. Well, there's the thought that every quarterback, every coach out there is going to tell themselves, hey, I can fix that situation. I can fix that guy. So I think that was one of the stipulations and one of the things that was kind of like a challenge. So that's the reason why they moved back up to get Paris Johnson, because he was a guy that Kyler Murray wanted. So they thought to themselves, you know what, let's give him what he wants in this situation. So the expectations were probably just going to be, we just don't want to look like an absolute laughing stock and look like we're getting embarrassed every single week. So they have been competitive, like at least day in and day out. When the offense has been good, the defense has looked horrible. When the defense looks good, the offense has looked horrible. But they're not trying to look like they're the worst team in the league. And I don't know if a lot of people can say that right now, going into week 13, I believe, or I'm not sure what week we're in. I think we're in week 14 or 15.
Yeah,
but they're not saying
week 15 is where we're heading.
Yeah, they're not saying that anymore. They're not saying like, hey, we're the worst team by a landslide. No, we have 2 teams that are ahead of us, and that's the Carolina Panthers, who look like the team that the so many people were talking about that the Cardinals were going to look like a total embarrassment. Like Bryce Young looks horrible out there, and a lot of people are trying to be fair towards him. So that was the goal. Don't make it look like the Cardinals are that team, and don't make it look like Kyler Murray is that quarterback, because they want to build around him. So I think one of the interesting stats that I found out, and I'll bring this up later on with SIS on two different fronts. I learned what they want to run on defense, and on offense, I learned what they're going to do with Kyler Murray, what they're doing with Kyler Murray. So I'll bring that up later because it's pretty interesting because it tells me more about the scheme. But I think the expectations, like I said, they were up in the air. They just don't want to be the worst.
Hey, Blake, can I jump in? I want to tie together some of the different things we've been talking about. There's because you posed a question earlier, in terms of these signature wins, and then is it that the Cardinals kind of overachieve on a couple wins, or is it that all these other games they kind of missed opportunities? What is this team? And then there comes this question of, okay, is it, as Walter kind of has been pondering, is it coaching or is it talent? Well, they have talent, but as you also pointed, there's injuries. And I think that there's an important thing to remember is young players tend to be less consistent. Veterans, a lot of times what the difference between a veteran and a rookie is not skill, but consistency, right? And then as those young players become veterans, they become more consistent. And that is typically those improvements we see. It's not that they become more skilled. It's just they become more consistent, right? So I think a team that plays like this, where they beat, at the time, one of the better teams in the NFL, the Cowboys, and then they start losing. And then, that sort of, kind of mercurial sort of identity to their wins and losses, I think is kind of characteristic of a team that has a lot of young players with talent who are going to be uneven in their performances, right? Inconsistent. So I think the question, there is lacking talent in terms of consistently performing. There are some nice pieces that I think we're all excited about. Dante Stills, Keitrell Clark, who I love as well, Garrett Williams, BJ Ojolari. But with, Garrett Williams has been consistent, but the rest of them, have had their ups and downs. And then we have players who are out with injury. So there's enough talent on this roster. It just either has been injured at points or hasn't consistently shown up because of youth. And I think that is part of what we're seeing here. And then there's this larger question of, they could have been more aggressive in free agency. But to me, there's a very clear roster building philosophy. And I think the smarter teams do it this way. Year one, you kind of clear the decks of the older veterans who aren't going to be part of the future, guys like DeAndre Hopkins, as talented as he is. And then you get in young players and you draft premium positions, tackle, cornerback, receiver, edge rusher. Those are a lot of the players they've drafted. You get those guys playing. And in free agency, you don't, throw all the money into free agency year one. You get a few key players who are going to help, like someone who, even though he isn't a true Mike linebacker, I would agree with you, he's better served at the will. But Kaiser White can call the signals because he knows the defense. So they bring him in, and he can help everyone else get acclimated because he knows the defense and can be the guy with the green dot. Yelda Froholt, a center who played with Petzing, right? Center is kind of the guy who sets the adjustments, on the offensive line. So that was strategic that they brought in a guy who could start. Is he the best center in the league? No, but he was a smart signing for what he can do for the whole offense, right? And people who study kind of roster building strategies and things, that if you're not following Sumer Sports, for example, Eric Eager does some great work over there. And one of the things he's kind of talked about is free agency is actually where you go after non-premium positions. You get the premium positions in the draft, you develop them, and you extend your own guys at those positions. But when you're going to free agency, that's where you kind of add a guard, add a linebacker, add a safety, just to kind of fill it out, and then also find value signings for depth. So from a process of a rebuild, I don't have any problems with what they did in free agency. I want those young players out there, especially at the premium positions, even if they're getting knocked around a little bit, because next year they're going to have that under their belt.
Yeah, about the defense. They didn't spend a lot, like Blake said, in free agency necessarily, but they picked up some key pieces, some of whom dropped off, like Rashad Fenton could have been a huge addition for us that they signed. 2 years ago, you had like a PFF grade close to 70 with the Chiefs. And I loved him with the Chiefs. He had a little bit of a down year in Atlanta after a trade there. And, unfortunately, he gets hurt. Then you have I think they weakened two positions by there's no reason why Zaven could have played the Mike and Kaiser could have played the Will, and Kaiser still could have had the green dot because you're not ever taking him off the field. And you're trying a new thing with Zaven. And don't get me wrong, he's been solid, but not, especially talented in rushing the passer, except on tech stunts and stuff. So he's still developing that part of his game, while Dennis Gardeck has been awesome. I mean, if I had an MVP vote, I'd give it to him. He is balling big time. He and Ojolari played great on the edge against, like Blake said, against Pittsburgh. That the hit of Pickett's arm on the first possession was huge by Gardeck, getting them off the field for a field goal when the Steelers were just marching. But you're also kind of pissing away some really good talent when you trade Isaiah Simmons for a 7th round pick. I mean, if you're not going to address it that much, you got to count on the guys you have there. I don't know of I've asked all around. I have all kinds of football coaches that I know and trust. I've asked every one of them, if given the chance, would you want to coach Isaiah Simmons? They all say, frick yeah. Are you kidding? And to give up on him like that, I thought was really egregious. And I don't see Isaiah Simmons as really a problem. I think that he got Vance Josephed into some really tough situations emotionally. And it was going to take some coaching to snap him out of that. Plus, he was trying to transition to a new position of free safety, which they asked him what he wanted to play. I think he should have been the outside linebacker where Collins is in the beginning. And he had a 65 PFF grade last year playing linebacker. And his coverage grade was good, even though we saw him get beat at some key times. And then Myjai Sanders, you just let him go. I mean, you have some guys there you can really work. I don't know what's been happening with Cameron Thomas, but he's a lot better than what he's been showing. I mean, he's really a baller, and I don't know why we're not getting much out of him. The pickups inside have been awesome. Still's been fantastic. Strong has been, I hope they re-sign him quickly. He's been a really good nose and stalwart up front. I really like the kid Lopez they picked up. Lopez has been really outstanding as well. I mean, that defensive line coach, Derek LeBlanc, he's coach of the year for me on this whole roster. What he's done, I mean, to lose Collier, and here's the other thing that was so disappointing. Rashad Lawrence, our best returning defensive tackle, is suddenly like not playing anymore. And, I don't know what happened to him. So, I mean, you had pieces in place there that could have worked out. We needed the back end of the secondary to be better. Jalen Thompson's balling from the box. He struggled at deep safety. We still need a center fielder in passing situations. Buddha came back, off the injury, and he's looked fine. So, I mean, but missing him for those stretch of games. I mean, there were a lot of I thought personnel misses, but I'm so glad they started rushing Gardeck again, because he's made a big difference with his, some of the plays he's made coming back to the football, just like outstanding. So, I mean, Collier going out. So, but the other guy I really like is Rich Rodriguez, what he's done with the edge guys. So they're in good shape, I think, in that coaching staff. And Rallis, I think, is a up and comer, but you got to game plan better. You got to know your opponent better. As long as here's the answer to Blake's question about what do you expect for the next 4 games. I just want to see them trying to do the right thing, like we've seen with K. Clark and this kid Devad Wilson played his butt off, starting the game last week, and Starling. These kids are playing hard. I just want to see them doing the right things, like when the ball's in the air, look back for the ball, don't grab. You know, show that you've been coached, and if they're doing the right things and they're getting beat because the talent on the other team, like the 49ers, is superior, then okay, you can live with that. But if they're kind of playing half-assed, which happens too often on this defense, where they're missing assignments and guys are wide open, and we finally covered the tight end really well, Fairmouth. That was huge in that game too. So, they've shown that they can do it. I mean, you beat the Cowboys with a good defense. You beat the Steelers with a good defense. You hung tough with the Falcons. Now, like Joe was saying about consistency, if they can get some consistency and better game planning, where we just see them trying to do the right thing, I think that would be a victory for me, and feeling like more of a confidence booster heading into next year.
Yeah, I think part of what I've at least felt with this Cardinals team, and this is again looking at a lot of those Steve Keim draft picks. Marco Wilson's a great example of someone who, at 6'1" and having the 4.3 speed, who at least is capable of having to keep up with cornerbacks, whereas a guy like a Keitrell Clark, we've seen earlier in the season, he had to learn how to not be as handsy in coverage, so he could still stay sticky and still stay physical, but not being able to not only get penalties, he would also have that aggressiveness get taken advantage of. And I think some of it is recognizing, hey, Marco is a guy who's a third-year player, while Keitrell is a guy that's in his first year. I think that there is a level of coachability, but also a spot of we probably underestimated, I think, in some cases, how rough it was, because last year Cardinals had a lot of injuries. Kyler went out. And then I think when we're seeing this year, obviously the left guard position is something that's had a struggle. We've seen them be able to effectively have a good offensive line this year, despite DJ Humphries taking a step back because of seeing Will Hernandez be healthy, Paris Johnson playing. It really is, I think, on the defensive side of the ball where you can at least see that there's players who have stepped up and are actually doing well. I think Zaven Collins, for all that we've talked about, at least as far as for whether he should be down in the middle or on the side, he's got a really good strength as being a run defender on the edge, which has really helped the Cardinals in a lot of ways. And then Dennis Gardeck has been a bit weaker against the run, but has at least been very efficient with his pass rushing. And you've almost kind of felt like that the Cardinals front office, they don't necessarily have complete players, but they're at least doing their best to maximize some of the guys with some of their strengths. I think it's the takeaway of some of these players maybe weren't as strong as their upside could have been. I think the biggest one that stands out there would probably be someone like Marco, at least, who is benched. And then there's other guys like Sterling Thomas who get hurt. You've been able to see Victor Dimukeje get a few sacks. And I think at the end of the day, it really is a spot of this is a team that is kind of having guys have to prove themselves, because if you look at Hollywood Brown, if the Cardinals wanted to re-sign him, you could have done that before the season started. If the Cardinals wanted to be able to try to change some of the cap hit for DJ Humphries, but add another couple of years, that was something that was doable as well. I do think that the way that this team has been constructed is that they weren't going to simply just raise everything to the ground, essentially, and just cut it all down and then go completely defeated. I think that's an approach that a lot of people think that teams will do. I think what Arizona did was they more decided to say, we're going to recognize Kyler's not going to play a lot this year. We're probably going to have maybe 1 or 2 wins by the time he comes back. We want to make sure we're freeing up cap space for 2024, and taking DeAndre Hopkins, who basically sat out the last 2 games, is not a guy that we really want to have as far as a culture builder. And I think a lot of the guys we've seen, some players have proven themselves ultimately, and others have really struggled with it. And I think that's probably easiest seen in the Keontae Ingram, who went from the clear cut second string running back to the third cut running back to basically being on the roster until Michael Carter was able to take over. And a lot of that, at least you can talk about the talent, the fit that he had in the scheme. And yet, Amari DiMercato has been stronger in pass protection and has been able to at least understand enough of the offense that he's been able to get positive yards, and to the point where, unfortunately, he got hurt. And Arizona is now in another spot. And I think that there is one of the things I did want to bring up that I do feel like bad luck is a part of this Cardinals equation that I think we'll look back on, because you look at how the other teams have lined up. The Rams were missing Cooper Kupp for the first 5 weeks of the season, and then week 6, oh look, they play Arizona, he gets 158 yards. Joe Burrow and the Bengals, they look like they're the worst team in football. Suddenly his ankle gets healthy, and you end up seeing Jamar Chase get 200 plus yards in the game. A lot of that against essentially just the outside coverage for the most part, at least that we got to see, with him taking advantage of Marco biting on some of those early routes to get wide open. And we've been able to see also, even in the Rams game, Kyron Williams, the Rams running attack had been doing nothing. Cooper Kupp even got hurt the week before. He sat out the rest of that game. Rams end up ultimately, I believe it was, I don't remember if they beat or lost to the Seahawks, but it was a close game at the end. He then comes back the following week, and I think there's pieces of some of that you put together. This is one of the first weeks where I felt like that the pendulum swung back Arizona's way, because, as like we said, Kenny Pickett ended up being out for the day. You saw another injury, and so it's not to say that Arizona essentially didn't get it, but I do think that health is an important part of football teams, and that's something that we haven't been able to see a lot of, I think, of this team, of what the potential of it could have been with Marquise Brown and Michael Wilson, Trey McBride full-time, having James Conner and a stable of healthy running backs. It almost feels like that in some cases the Cardinals kind of have been working their way through guys who are like part of their identity moving forward, with Kyler coming back. Like, you can tell Michael Carter, he's shown enough. I think he'll be back as a running back 3 next year. Everyone knows that DiMercato is for sure going to be one of those players. And we've been able to at least see, if the Cardinals did want to keep Zaven Collins for a while, we've seen production to the point where I don't think people would really mind that much if he signed a 2-year deal. And so in that result, it almost feels to me, at least, and this is something, Marcos, you can probably chime in on that, we're at least seeing the Cardinals as they're kind of growing slowly over time with the coaching staff. And the benefit of the doubt, I think, at least in a lot of ways, goes to Michael Bidwell for giving this team a bit of time to actually have to come together and gel, because coming into this season, I think most people would have said that, oh, this is just, he's going to wreck this, things are going to be terrible, this Jonathan Gannon's going to end up being let go, and they get another quarterback and dump Kyler. And we're seeing instead now is everyone's like, Michael who? Let's talk about what's going on with the Panthers over there with Bryce Young. And that's something that he's not going to get credit for, because that's an issue. But I do think that by giving the coaching staff enough time to like work through and build their culture, we've seen some of the results be able to pay off. And one of those is last week, we were able to see that in the Steelers game, where Mike Tomlin, who is vaunted coach who'd been able to win all these close games, ended up losing by double digits to the Cards.
We also got to take into account they also lost to the Patriots this Thursday night. And I don't know if you guys pay attention to your name tree. He's a Yinzer, probably one of the loudest Yinzers out there. He is very disappointed about it. So like that team is in somewhat of a flux, especially because of the fact that, like, since Mitchell Trubisky takes that team, of course it's a different look. But obviously we were not supposed to even have a chance, even if that was the case. So we overachieved for what the goal was and what the goal should be when it came to like going into their territory, going to what we thought was going to be a super hostile environment. And also with all the situation that was happening with the delays, where we had a rain delay that pushed it back probably like 30 minutes to an hour, happened again. So it just kept like throwing everything out of whack. At least it gave them a chance to be able to feel what the game plan was, and they executed it. So I would say that was unexpected for me, because I thought it was going to be the total opposite. I thought it was going to be a situation where we were going to try to keep it close, especially what we just saw with the Los Angeles Rams. Now, obviously we have our own, gauntlet of our NFC West opponents who we faced before. And they're going to do what they always do, and what they're always going to do is on offense, they're just going to run the ball. You're going to do a lot of inside zone on us, stretch runs to the outside, a lot of stuff under center. On defense, they're just going to create what you have been calling, Walter, a picket fence, so that they can try to mask that front side and just have them throw to the outside if that is what they're going to try to do as a game plan. And it sucks because the Los Angeles Rams and both the LA Rams and the San Francisco 49ers have like at least a super all-pro player on their defensive line that is like a person who can just like the people that like our offensive coordinator has to take account for. And there are certain things that you can't do because of these players and the impact that they have. So it takes away from what the Cardinals try to do offensive wise. So the game, the interesting thing for me was when they were coming into the season on defense, what were they going to do more of, and what were they going to call? Were they going to do a situation where it was going to be similar to what they did back in Philadelphia, and on defense because we inherited Jonathan Gannon, and there was rumors about Vic Fangio running the show. Were they going to go with a Vic Fangio cover 6, which is more of a quarter half scheme? And what were they going to do, and who was going to play those roles? I had predicted that maybe Marco was going to be the man coverage corner, and on the opposite side, we were going to have the zone coverage corner. And I was completely wrong with that, prediction, because Marco there was things, and I saw him in the last season, and I don't know why I didn't take account to this, so I'll take responsibility for not bringing this up. But he looked really good when he was off ball. Maybe that was the reason why he had so much success under Vance Joseph. And if you're playing more off the line of scrimmage, like 7 to 10 yards off the line of scrimmage, you're more so reading the quarterback than you are reading the actual wide receiver. And when I was watching him trying to read the wide receiver, I don't know if it's just that he just bites too fast on the moves. You're not supposed to be paying attention to what they're doing up here. You're supposed to be paying attention to the waist, right? Because the hips, like they say, the hips don't lie. So they'll tell you what direction the wide receiver is going. So he doesn't have that technique down, and maybe it's just not something that he can develop. But when he's looking at the quarterback and he's taking zone turns to try to predict where a route is going to be ran, like he's a lot better when it comes to that part. So being that off ball, obviously you kind of use a bail technique to read the quarterback, so you're ahead of the wide receiver no matter what. He gives up those underneath passes because that's what's going to happen. That's going to be the weakness. But anything deeper than that or anything coming across, he would be better than. And I mean, there was that great interception he had on Tom Brady when Tom Brady was trying to hit Mike Evans, where he completely read the ball and went under it and intercepted it because of the athleticism he has. I haven't given up on Marco Wilson. I just think the coaching staff needs to see what they did with Marco towards the end of last season and try to implement that with him. And this defense has been more of a zone heavy, and it's almost been by far more zone heavy type of defense. I noticed that they call a lot of cover 3 and quarters. Quarters is not surprising, but I thought they were going to try to implement like a split, like a zone, like a split coverage, where one side of the field is man, the other side of the field is quarters. Right. You're going to have your Meg, like the Meg corner, the guy that goes everywhere with it. I thought that was going to be like our number one corner. We have to figure out who that person was, but we were going to figure it out when we take our lumps. But it's been more zone on both sides of the field. It's been more like Jalen Thompson coming into the box a lot in those cover 3 calls, and Buda Baker being the top safety. So when we were missing Buda Baker, we had, I believe it was a Sterling Shepard or whoever that safety was. And that safety was actually the fault of why we got those deep throws thrown on us, because he read these wrong. Like Marco was supposed to pass off, he's supposed to pass off that post, and Sterling Shepard would come down instead of sinking in his coverage and wouldn't pick him up, and that's how we were getting exploited. So now that we have Buda back, he's the guy who's constantly just rotating from his cover 3 look down to like the cover 2 look, and then they're doing a lot of mismatch with that. So that's probably what we're going to go into when we're talking about the future of this team. They're going to maybe draft in, thoughts about that. But last against the Eagles, they still had their med corner. We know who that med corner was. It was Darius Slay. So we need that med sticky up on the line of scrimmage corner. And now on offense, by Sports Info Solutions, I put this on Twitter. The tight end is the number one target for Kyler Murray. He's targeted Trey McBride and the tight end position more than any other quarterback has since week 10. He's really forming a bond, and that's good chemistry. Where he's targeting around the field is a lot of these short, like intermediate kind of middle to the right side. I believe it's the right side, yeah. So it was the right side. So he's hitting them on a lot of those, and then the intermediate routes as well. He's really trusting Trey McBride. I think Trey McBride is that relationship between him and Kyler is going to be big going forward. That success is going to be brought upon whether those two are going to be able to play on an all-pro level together.
Right. Joe, what are your thoughts?
Oh, there's a lot we just covered.
I was gonna say there's so much, at least when it comes to coverages or other stuff that Marcos goes over, at least, that sometimes we'll be like in our film stream, like, oh, an hour's passed, we need to wrap it up at least for the most part. So
yeah, and I know Walter, you're limited on time, so I want to.
No, don't worry about that, Joe. Okay. I want to hear you.
So, we talked about like cornerbacks and coverage. Marco Wilson, kind of came on towards the end of second half of last season. Something just hasn't worked. I mean, he's been the lowest graded cornerback this year. And he's played that number one cornerback role. So he's had, to cover the best receivers typically. So he's been targeted, but there are other cornerbacks on this roster, undrafted rookie free agents who have stepped in and done that and still graded better, right? Sterling Thomas did,
right.
Antonio Hamilton when he, was out there before he got injured. Keitrell
Right.
Clark has graded better. Devad Wilson hasn't graded particularly well, but still better than Mark. Like no one has graded worse than Marco Wilson. I think they gave him an extended tryout to see if he could work in this defense, and it didn't work, and they pulled him. I think they tried to give him every chance.
Benched. He was like benched, like, hey, you're going to be active on game day, but you're not going to play. Even when we saw an injury to Sterling Thomas, he didn't come in and play. They brought in someone else over him, and so it was a point of it's probably at this point just seems like that it's over. Now, I do think that maybe there's a chance for him to earn his way back onto it through whether it's practice or through games. I like the fact that at least there is accountability, and what we've also seen is Keitrell got benched because there were some issues that he had earlier in the season, and then he ended up working his way back in. It wasn't just Devad, and it wasn't just Sterling Thomas, and his play is also reflecting it by, I can say, he's markedly been better than he at least had been in the previous upcoming weeks. That's something that I think with the coaching staff, there's a weird balance you have to find of maximizing talent, and also there are guys who do need to ultimately step up and make a lot of plays. If you're going to end up putting everything on coaching and saying that the coaches aren't using a player right, while a player is also then biting on the Sean McVay quarterback fake where they're not maintaining the edge, then you're going to end up with issues. And I think we saw a lot of that in years past with the Cardinals where guys would not stay disciplined. You think of Vance Joseph saying we talked about the boot. This year, I haven't seen the same issues with the bootlegs against the Rams that we saw previously. There'd be a player in Stafford's face or at least being able to apply pressure versus just not having anyone in the area. And it does make me feel like at least that there is building blocks that this team can have in some of the players. And at least in terms of coaching, you're at least being able to see some of that go through the accountability. And Walter, you're probably the one, at least if you want to make another comment before you head out, what you feel like as far as what you have seen that's good from the coaching staff and also what you'd like to see with 4 games left in the season from them.
Well, before I have a couple things I want to mention at the end. I just want to stick with Joe for a second. Joe, Garrett Williams, what a find, huh?
Right.
Wow.
Yeah, they've been playing him in the slot, and would love to see him move to the outside. But he's been the highest graded cornerback on this team as a rookie. And that now you can argue that there wasn't a lot of premier talent at cornerback on this roster coming in, but he has been consistent and outstanding, and I'm really excited for him as a piece of the long-term future for this team.
Yeah, I think he has tremendous versatility. I saw at times at Syracuse they put him in the deep middle, and he was making interceptions. He's instinctive. He plays leverage perfectly. I mean, that kid has been coached, and he came in with that knowledge. Because if you could coach Marco Wilson to do that, oh boy. I mean, with Wilson's physical gifts, Marcos, the thing why I've given up on Wilson is he doesn't tackle. And if you don't tackle in today's football at corner, you can't play. So much of the game are those bubble screens, and you can't hide a corner anymore. So if you're not in, look at what Catrell Clark did, which by the way I thought was so bogus again, and to put him isolated on Cooper Kupp without any safety help, and he dog Kupp. He was with him stride for stride on that deep pass, and it took a perfect pass and a perfect catch, and he tackled Kupp immediately. And then he got stuck on the goal line in a situation where he had no inside help, and he was trying to play inside leverage on him because he didn't want to just give Kupp a slant for a touchdown. And so Kupp gave him a head fake and ran the out pass, which Stafford threw before he even made his cut to the pylon. I mean, that's an indefensible play if you're playing inside leverage, and they knew that. And then he gets benched, and I'm like, I mean, give the guy a fair chance. For what, 3 games? While Marco Wilson is awful and playing the whole time still. But notice what Catrell did. He came back and started hitting people. That first game back, he came up, he blew up screens. I mean, how to endear yourself to coaches from the cornerback position is he could control what he could control. And he led the team tied for tackles in that first game back. Looked like he had like 11 or 12. And I mean, like impact tackles, not like just push you out of bounds. And he plays his ass off, which you'll just love. You love the effort. Starling Thomas, same thing, plays his tail off. He's a baller. That kid will stick you. I mean, don't get me wrong, we got to add a couple corners this offseason. But from what we see and Garrett Wilson, I mean, how often now are we seeing people beat us from the slot? I haven't seen it. Have you?
He's been great.
He has locked that down, and it's freed up Jalen to be a rover, and that's the role for Jalen. Underneath rover, he lights out on that. And then, like you said, Marcos, they have Buddha in the back. He's better as a rover too. They got to do something about free safety. That's why I was hoping Isaiah would work out, because we get beat deep too many times without safety help. And if you had a good guy with range there. So I just ended on this one note. We're talking about consistency. I just want to give one example for offense. So encouraged with that 99-yard drive, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then we going into halftime. Plus, they scored it right before that second pass to McBride. I was going crazy. I'm sure you guys were too. I mean, that touchdown McBride had was hands down a touchdown. That was just ridiculous that they called that off. But then to come right back to him, I love the way Kyler just perfectly fit that ball in there, and McBride caught it. So now they have the long extended break. They come back. The Cardinals have the ball. So they've just gone 99 yards, and the secret was situational football. They played perfectly, right?
Mm-hmm.
So here's the consistency thing. First play is a 1-yard pass to Jeff Swain. Why? I mean, it's just a 1-yard out pass. Why? I mean, Swain's not going to beat anybody. I mean, turn the corner. I mean, he had a guy right on him. Boom, it's a 1-yard game. Second down. Predictable run for 5 yards by Connor. So now it's situational football. It's 3rd and 4. Do you remember the play? Do they throw over the sticks? No. They run the shallow mesh. And to Marquise Brown, who's 2 yards from the line of scrimmage, from the line to gain. It makes no sense. And that's what they did with Dobbs repeatedly. That's why Red Sea on ROTB called it just what it was, 3rd and give up. I mean, it made no sense to me. Like, did you learn anything about that 99-yard drive? And this is the thing with Petzing that concerns me, is situational football is having plays designed where you have on your play sheet, you'll have 3rd and 5s. You should have a list of like 7 plays you've gone over in practice so that you're throwing beyond the sticks at least, or you're working something out. And if they start to do that over the last 4 games, it's better situationally, even if it's incomplete, but they're trying to convert. I'm going to be fine with that. As long as they're like doing right things situationally, like the goal line stand. Oh my God. That was like, and I have to say this, and it's the last thing I'll say. I was just happy they were in a goal line defense. I mean, it's the 49ers when we played them. It's like 1st and goal from the 3-yard line. We're in the regular base defense. We don't even have another lineman in there. And, McCaffrey goes in scot-free for 3 yards and untouched. I mean, it's moments like that where it makes me shake my head and go, for situational football and what players are supposed to do. The other thing is, look at the inside linebackers. I mean, I love Josh Woods, the person. He's an awful NFL linebacker. Awful. Just watch him for keys on the running back. Just isolate your eyes on that, and you'll see how out of position. You'll see why he's getting like 30s and the most 40 game grades from PFF. He's just not instinctive. He hasn't been coached properly, and he's too diminutive for the position. So that's something. If you just look at how they're being coached, we need it to be stronger, and we need more prototypical players at positions. Like the 2 inside linebackers has to get straightened up.
I was going to say, Owen Papo at least seems that he's actually done pretty well in the small limited snaps that he has had, and he's obviously a developmental guy that was a heat-seeking missile that was similar to, I think we compared him to Simmons in some regard, but I think that is definitely something of seeing how it'll look in the backstretch. Thanks again so much for joining us, Walter. At least appreciate your time for everything. We'll probably only go for like a few more minutes at least.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Thanks so much. At least again, you can find
Happy holidays.
Absolutely. At least you can find him on the Red Rain podcast and revengeofthebirds.com. We've got 4 games left of this Cardinal season, Joe. I think the biggest thing we want to make sure that we can be able to check in on is what is the strategy for this team moving forward? Because people who wanted the Cardinals to essentially get a top 5 pick, congratulations. Unless they end up winning the next 3 games, you're pretty much almost guaranteed of them getting a top 5 pick. And 2 of those games are against the Eagles outside on the road and against the Niners at home. So you're probably going to be looking at a top 3 pick for this team. How should this team be able to build? Because most fans, I think at this point, accepted that the Cardinals are going to have a high pick. I've accepted that the Texans pick is not going to be quite as high. When it comes to team building, I think that there's a lot of people are questioning coming into this season, is Kyler Murray the guy? I think we've seen enough evidence thus far with him coming back. The team's not just gone 2-2. We've seen enough to say that he's not necessarily someone that you need to replace and move on from. I've been that person of saying, do you weigh how much of it is the talent around him? How much is he carrying? Seeing where some of that is. If we take the Kyler Murray question out of the equation, and I think a top 3 pick versus top 2 pick may do that, how should the Cardinals look at building some of this team in the offseason?
Yeah, I think in general, they're going to continue to do kind of what I talked about earlier, look at drafting premium positions in the first couple of days of the draft, and then non-premium positions later, and then do some, free agency patchwork. But in terms of like at the top of the draft, right? Obviously, if you're in that position in the top 3, depending on how high, if you're at one of those quarterback spots, 1 or 2, then maybe you look to trade back a spot. But really the big question, and this is the question that's been going around on Twitter, Cardinals Twitter, is Marvin Harrison Jr. or the field, right? I kind of tweeted some things out about that maybe were got a little bit of disagreement on, and I think people probably a little misunderstood my position. There's no player in this draft I'm taking ahead of Marvin Harrison Jr. There's no other player I would take before him. But I do see other paths to good roster building that involve trading back and not taking him, but instead getting maybe 3 starters if you do it right in terms of the trade. I mean, you trade back a couple spots, you could get a couple day 1 and 2 picks plus a few others, so that becomes the question. And I'm not set on which way I would go. I see a successful path both ways. So if you stick and pick with Marvin Harrison Jr., you've got your elite receiver. And then with that pick from the Texans, if you can get Newton, the defensive tackle, somehow, whether you have to trade up a little bit or he happens to be there, if you get Marvin Harrison Jr. and Newton out of the first round, to me, that is a dream haul. But there's if you trade back, and you chimed in on that, like, hey, okay, trade back.
I really like that.
One receiver. Yeah, make sure you get 1 receiver in the first round. So I do think getting a receiver in the first round, whether it's Marvin Harrison Jr. or someone later, is an important thing to do, especially if they don't end up extending Hollywood, which is now kind of uncertain.
Yeah,
but I think you have
570. So real quick, 51 receptions, 574 yards, about 10 yards or so a catch. We know that he's been in that outside wide receiver 1 role versus more of a kind of hybrid, moving him around. The last few games are interesting because in the Rams game, we got to see him have 6 catches for 88 yards, mostly in all garbage time. But in a competitive game against the Texans, 2 for 18, and then no catches in the Steelers game. I think what's interesting is that it does feel like that heel injury is a big part of what has either held him back, and whether that's related to injuries holding him back thus far. It's also a factor of what the team build. If you're going to have a smaller type of receiver, and I thought that we were going to see more of an impact, at least in the deep passing game, as far as for maybe more of a T.Y. Hilton effect, taking the top off the defense. It feels like that has not really been, not only not his usage, but maybe not as much of his game, at least, where we've been able to see that be more of even, belong to the Greg Dortch or Rondale Moore having actually gotten some of those deep passing targets. And I think that it's really not a question to me of do you want to keep Hollywood or not. I think it's going to be the opportunity cost, because again, football, zero-sum game. We know that if Hollywood Brown at least is going to get paid by the Cardinals, that's money they could be bringing in at another spot or another position. So then it kind of ends up coming to is how is the best way you're going to be able to build with the limited amounts that you have because of the cap. You don't have the ability to sign Shohei Ohtani for 6 years and $700 million or so like that for the most part.
Right.
So that's something we've seen with the Kansas City Chiefs. A few years ago, they paid Marquez Valdes-Scantling a 3-year, $30 million contract, and now we're in year 2 of that contract. And I look at DeAndre Hopkins and go, that's the money that they could have probably given him a 1-year deal, which like they did to Juju Smith-Schuster. They ended up giving it to the guy wanting that deep threat ability. He's not as good of a player, and that money is already allocated with about $9 to $10 million this year. Whereas you probably could have just gotten by with a 1-year deal. And it just shows like that's how the zero-sum game works, is that their draft picks then haven't stepped up the same way of hitting on guys like we've seen in the past. Now, Steve Cobb, he would take that to like the ultimate level where they would be trading away draft picks to have to get a starting center who's aging, having to get this wide receiver 1. And then the other first-round picks wouldn't work out. So suddenly you're having to now invest in a linebacker after signing a linebacker after already drafting Isaiah Simmons. So I think that what I've at least felt like as far as for team building is that the Cardinals have put themselves in a spot where they're putting as many resources as they can into getting cheap talent. And it's going to be interesting if this year's draft class is any indication, maybe they can go out and be able to actually do a better job of scouting. And that may be the best methodology to end up building to build the team.
Well,
He didn't even stick at linebacker, and Vance
Right.
Joseph kept moving him around the field. So I think they would have stuck him at linebacker. We'd be able to assess better and be able to say, after 3 years, if he just stuck to that position, got the keys down on that position, was able to learn the NFL defense that he wanted to, I think then we can properly assess whether or not they didn't have to go out and get one. I just don't understand why Vance had to keep moving him around and they kept Jordan Hicks all that time because they had Devontae Campbell when they drafted Isaiah Simmons, so they had no idea what to expect from any of that. So I don't think it's a fair assessment to make on Isaiah, but it is what it is. He's gone anyway.
Yeah, and going back to how they should build this team and the question of Hollywood, I think that they're going to build this team a much more run-heavy, defense-heavy team, and with tight ends being emphasized, Trey McBride being one of your key receivers. And I don't, under Cliff Kingsbury, they built this team. That offense, you needed a lot of good receivers, and that's why it didn't work at points because as there were injuries to receivers, it just the offense couldn't function the way Cliff wanted it to. And this offense is going to be very different, right? A wide zone with some West Coast passing concepts, kind of what they brought from Cleveland and whatever wrinkles they want to add to that. And you don't need to. If you're going to have Trey McBride being one of your key pass catchers, you don't need to have 3 elite receivers. What you need is a fast guy to take the top off the defense, and he doesn't have to be a Pro Bowl caliber guy. He just needs to be fast, because even if he's not elite in the other capacities of the game, if he's going on a go route, the defense isn't going to let him go, right? Even, Ted Ginn Jr. made a career doing that and wasn't the best hands at receiver, but it doesn't matter for the most part in terms you can still impact the game. So, Hollywood Brown, you thought, well, he could be that guy because he has that speed. But as you point out, Blake, they haven't used him that way, right? And I don't think this offense is going to be built with that type of receiver as one of your primary kind of volume receivers, right? They're going to want bigger volume receivers, guys like Michael Wilson, guys like potentially Marvin Harrison Jr., or getting a second tight end to kind of be a partner in crime with Trey McBride. You don't want kind of I think back to like Mike Wallace, the guy from the Steelers, that kind of, that primary receiver who's kind of slight and fast. This kind of offense, I don't think, is built with that as a primary receiver. So now I'm starting to think, as much as I like Hollywood Brown, if you take the connection with Kyler out, the personality, the friendship thing, he's good for this offense as that deep threat if they use him that way. But I don't feel like from a roster building, and you mentioned the zero-sum game in terms of salary cap, allocating potentially upwards of 18, 20 million a year for the guy who's just that deep threat. And, that doesn't make sense. You can draft that guy, like a Tutu Atwell is a perfect example of a guy that was drafted for that role. And you don't have to pay to have that guy. You can find that guy every 4 years in the draft, allocate a day 2 pick for him and use him. So, but yeah, you got to get some defense. So you need one receiver, I think, and you need the rest. Most of your other day 1 and 2 picks probably need to be defense. I think you need an interior pass rusher more than you need edge rushers. You've got some guys you can work with, develop there. Get an interior pass rusher, and then maybe get another outside rusher if you want to kind of develop. I think they got some nice guys they can work with there. And you need a cornerback to get who you feel like is going to be a starter on the outside. And then you need in rounds between rounds 3 and 6, you need some inside linebackers. You can get a 3rd round inside linebacker can be a starter for you. So they need some help there. So those are things I think they need to do in terms of roster building. Hollywood Brown is maybe. There's a lot of other players we could talk about, but I know we don't want to be here all night.
Right. I do agree, at least. I think that's a really important one. I agree with the defensive interior, not just for pass rushing, but the Cardinals are the 2nd worst team as far as for rushing yards per game, given up at nearly 140. And I think a lot of that is simply just because we saw them not re-sign Zach Allen, J.J. Watt retired. Those were the 2 stalwarts that were basically their players. And the only team that is worse than them has been the Denver Broncos against the run. Well, that's basically because the Broncos were averaging the NFL all worst against defense of all time. Last few weeks, they've won 5, I think it is 6 out of their last 7, interestingly enough. And even though they've had still some issues with that bad start, I think that I agree with you in terms of premium positions. The edge rusher is a big part of it. But we've seen at least the impact that guys who are able to kind of stop the run up the middle and being able to have linebackers or in their gaps are as a important part of the team. One thing at least is this is the last part on Hollywood Brown before we'll have to move on at least is just looking at that 3rd and 4th play that Walter brought up. And this is kind of in the YouTube clip. He does say that they run the mesh concept at least where you're able to see. And looking at the all 22 angle, you can watch 24, Joey Porter Jr., as far as for one of the areas of recognition that he's able to make and how Hollywood, I don't believe he played many snaps after this, so whether the foot injury bothered him or not, he essentially is in man coverage over the top. You can see they've got trips left down over there, and then all Rondale Moore is trying to do is just get in the way of this cornerback. If he actually blocks or gets in the way, then that's going to be an offensive pass interference. Porter Jr. actually, his reaction and response time, he not only is able to get away from that concept, but is able to then make a perfect way of closing in on the ball, getting in front of the receiver. And when you look at it in this angle, Hollywood ends up kind of trying to cradle the ball a bit against him versus kind of reaching out with the hands. And I think that one of the things I wonder at least is how much of that speed, and you can even see there he slows up, whether you want to say how much of that is a little bit of a throw by Kyler that maybe needs to be outside, how much of that speed maybe of ability to run away from a guy. And that's one of the areas I think ultimately that's hard to know about the NFL is guys are going to regress, not just in terms of injuries like Rashard Lawrence, who would show great stretches of play, would get hurt, and then over time you would just see now he's on a practice squad because he's just not able to get the full-time starting reps. Being able to see guys over there, there's maybe a little bit of a tug at least, but you have to be able to play through that as a receiver. A lot of I think what ends up happening with the NFL for the most part is that players at one part are going to have to be able to make plays, but it's that physical talent that you see and being able to execute is a huge portion of that game. Here at least Kyler is able to throw the ball. It's a little bit short, but the entire route is designed to get Hollywood to try to get him where he's got a guy who's blocking, freeing him up to be able to catch the ball and be able to have his speed to get to the outside. And like Walter said, it just doesn't work. And not only that, but he doesn't even catch the ball to be able to get it into a 4th and 1, 4th and 2. For what we know, they may have been going, hey, we've got guys in the backfield. We can run and get this 4th down. We just need to get it in 4th and 1 and trust Hollywood's speed to make up. And instead they punt. I think that that's just one of the signs at least of saying, hey, like whether it's the foot needs to get right and we'll see that post by, I think we can watch that. But in this case, I also feel like if he's not going to have that same type of burner speed, even with those unrealized air yards, health is one of those things that you have to, in the NFL, be able to have. And that's just one of the spots that we don't see him being able to go up against a rookie corner in junior. He is able to sniff out the play, make the use, and then he kind of cradling the ball versus that strong hands catch. I think there's at least a combination of things that happen here, but on that 3rd and 4 call, it just is one of those places of Kyler trusts his guy to make the play. He doesn't even look at Rondale because Rondale is just supposed to be the blocker. He ends up becoming actually more free if you watch on that play. I just think that at least at the end of the line, you're probably going to be looking at trusting and saying, what is what we need to do as far as executing as what the players are being asked to do? And what is it as far as for the play that isn't on necessarily the players on the coaching? I think that we're seeing the blend and combination means if you don't have it working with what it currently is supposed to be, you may need to go out and get another guy who does fit that. And that's where I think you could be with Hollywood Brown, especially at that cost.
Yeah, I think that was a little bit more of a chemistry type of thing because you can see that they didn't come together on what they were supposed to do. If Hollywood was supposed to go further out to try to catch that, and if Kyler Murray was supposed to put it more towards the outside. But, oh man, that Joey Porter Jr. is quite a talent that I kind of wish he would have picked up. And he looks like the number 1 corner for the Steelers. And thank God that they have him because Patrick Peterson hasn't been holding his own on that defense. But now we know that Joey Porter Jr. is that guy. So he got drafted by his dad's, his dad's, his team. So now he's drafted
First
into the
pick
black
of
and
the
yellow.
second round, so that was an interesting case of we'll never know because he got taken one pick before the Cardinals at 33. They didn't trade up into the first round, and they trade back with the Titans to get a third rounder for this year. So it'd be interesting
Yeah.
if that was the guy that they had been eyeballing or something like that because they did go after Garrett Williams in round 3 after that, looking for a cornerback. So
I gotta say my parting words because my son, he's in the background. He's very anxious, and you already know how he loves to say hi. So I'm gonna say some parting words and stuff. Hey, I'm sorry about what's going on this side. I have a cat and I have a turtle cage right here or a turtle tank right here, and she keeps trying to get onto the turtles. I mean, I think Joe, you can relate to how your cats can be and stuff. So I keep having to look over, like get away from them. But also I appreciate you guys coming out for this quad stream. I think we, as a group, we make up like a good discourse where we take in a lot of nuance and that we have different positions. 2 of us can match, 2 of us don't match, but we always match in one way or another because we can see like from what we speak, we're speaking it from like a place of knowledge. We're trying to get a data driven and a knowledge driven stuff, and then we have these conversations where I wish we could be a part of hey, what do you think the Cardinals should do? Oh, you know what? We have thoughts about it. We have thoughts about it. And then at some point, we either mesh together or when we don't mesh, we try to see what the other person's point of view is. And that's what I love about having Joe Camo. I love having Walter. I can say Walter before he left. I love having him on too. And of course, my co-host, Blake Murphy Jr. And I thank you all for making this a great stream and a great stream where we shared a lot and stuff, and we even got our little film thing going, so we pretty much checked all the bases. But I'm gonna have to say goodbye to you guys.
Always good to see you, Marco.
All right, see you guys. Thank you.
Take care. Yeah, we can wrap up as well, Joe. Any parting thoughts that you would have as far as with the next 4 games? I'm looking at these and saying I think that the Cardinals, just from how things have been, it would not shock me at all if they do end up dropping the next few games. Maybe if they do win one, I think that it could be either Seattle or the Bears. Seattle's still going to be playing for a playoff spot in that last game, and it feels in a lot of ways like that if the Cardinals end up getting more than a top 3 pick, it almost feels like in some way it wouldn't shock me if Kyler Murray takes a look at the team and goes, you know what, if you're going to go and take a Harrison Jr. and not trade back, then not to say that they would lose for that one, but there sometimes can be a place of where you look at how a schedule lines up, you look at a vision. Sometimes they just match. Last year, the Cardinals' vision that we got to see was they wanted to be able to get as high a draft pick as they could. And then when they traded back, they got a good enough offer from a team that they were able to do that with the Houston Texans. This year, it'll be interesting to find out what kind of that vision is, and I'm really curious at least to be able to see, but it's a spot where if the Cardinals end up with the top 2 pick because of the Patriots getting another win against the Jets and they lose out, I think that's going to open up a whole other box of questions. And I said, let's not talk about that until they're actually picking there, just because that's a whole other place. What do you think, at least as far as for what we as fans should want for the last 4 games? And then that'll probably be it for as far as our last comments for the show.
Yeah, I know so many fans have been focused on, this idea of, getting the early pick and, the tank narrative and now it's Marvin Harrison Jr., conversations. And, I think whether we like it or not, the Cardinals aren't trying to lose games, at the players and the coaches. I understand the argument that the team constructed in a way that it wasn't going to be competitive. And I think that's more about the rebuild process than it is about an overt attempt to get early draft picks. It's that process of kind of turning over the roster, drafting those premium positions, giving them playing time. That process is going to end up losing the first year. So it looks like tanking, but the end goal is the larger rebuild process. And the early picks are a side benefit of that. But I think, the process that we have to kind of be mindful of that we're going to see, and this is, I think what the process is they are trying to get things in place that 2024 they can be competitive and shoot for a playoff spot. And I think what that means right now is, sure, they could try to do things that would be a little more towards Kyler's kind of liking or what he's done in the past and he's good at, and play a little more hero ball, and they could maybe put up a few more points in the short run. But I think what they're doing is what I talked about earlier, where they are trying to get him into the system, comfortable with the system, playing within the system. And it looks like he is trying to do that. Like I said, there were plays where he took sacks where in the past he wouldn't have. He would have, he bailed in the past much earlier. Now he's trying to stay in and find the open receiver. I was looking at some of the advanced stats. His average depth of target is a full yard more than it is been at any point in his career.
Yeah.
Right. 9.4 yards.
The system is working better than what we saw with Cliff, where it was all built on breaking tackles, getting guys there at low yards per attempt, and the teams eventually stopped that.
Yeah,
pretty easily.
So I think there's a process going on that of him getting acclimated to it. He's not going to put up the big yards consistently or as many big plays, but as he gets more acclimated and more comfortable with the system and everything kind of gets on track, this is a kind of offense that, with a combination of the running game and the passing game and more efficiency, can eventually get rolling. But don't look for that right away. Don't look for the big breakout game where, we're used to seeing Kyler have some big games and then an off game, big games and an off game. That's what we saw under Cliff. I don't think it's going to be like that. It's going to be much more of a steadier progression to get everything going. And next year, the hope being it can be a well-oiled machine. So that's the way I'm approaching it. And that's what I think would be the best way as a fan to approach it in terms of your expectations. Don't expect the big Kyler, explosive offensive game, but do look for it to become incrementally more refined, more efficient, and more on track.
I think that's something definitely to look for, especially since they've got a defense that hasn't looked as great in the Eagles. Another disappointing Seahawks defense. Next week against the Niners, it's going to just probably end up being a similar result to other ones. Let's hope that it can be more like the first Niners game where the Cardinals put up more points than a lot of other teams did and kept it close. Thanks again for those who stayed all the way to the end. We're just wrapping up here, and it's been a good 90 minutes talking Cards football. We're hoping that we can have maybe one more additional show this week at least. It would probably be on Saturday for the most part. Thank you guys for tuning in. It's been the Redbird Reboot. For Walter Mitchell at least, and for Marcos Labrado, again, for the guy who's still with me here, it's Joe Como. I'm Blake Murphy. Been a great podcast this time, but it's time for us to log off. Take care, everyone.